Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Dan Reynolds, Senior Editor of Risk and Insurance Magazine, and we're here to discuss the implications of what could be a nightmare supply chain disruption scenario. What would happen should a catastrophe like those that have hit Japan and Thailand this year strike the east coast of China, where more than 60% of that country's industry is located? There is serious concern as to whether risk management in China is advanced enough to protect its manufacturers and their supply chains should such a catastrophe occur. This webinar will present new intelligence from FM Global Senior Vice President Ken Davey about corporate leaders' attitudes and concerns about their supply chain exposures in China. We will also feature today strategies from Georgia Tech Operations Management Professor Vinod Singhal on managing these exposures while creating buy-in from senior management. Before we get started, a few brief housekeeping notes of which you should all be aware. Be sure to have the volume turned up on your computer to hear the audio for this webinar. If you're having problems hearing the audio through your computer, please click on the Request Teleconference button, which is located at the bottom of the participant panel in the upper right corner of your screen. To ask a question about the content of the presentation during the event, you may use the Q&A panel located in the bottom right corner of your screen. We'll be leaving time at the end of the presentation to answer them. Within 48 hours, a link to an archived version of the presentation will be emailed to you. A copy of the slides will be posted on the Risk and Insurance website. If you encounter a problem during today's webinar, please send us a message in the chat box located in the right column of your screen, or feel free to contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. We'd like to thank today's sponsor, which is FM Global. For more than 175 years, many of the world's largest organizations have turned to FM Global to develop cost-effective property insurance and engineering solutions to protect their business operations from fire, natural disasters, and other types of property risk. FM Global forms long-term partnerships with its clients to support risk management objectives through a unique combination of engineering, underwriting, and claims. For more information about FM Global's unrivaled products and services, visit www.fmglobal.com. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker, Kenneth W. Davey, is Senior Vice President, Managing Director, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, Asia Pacific for FM Global. He's based in the company's EMEA Asia Pacific Division headquarters in Windsor, England. Davey began his career in the London office of Factory Mutual International, now also a part of FM Global. He's a graduate of Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland, and received his bachelor's degrees in math, economics, and electrical engineering. Our second speaker, Vinod Singhal, is the Brady Family Professor of Operations Management at the College of Management at Georgia Institute of Technology. He's the Associate Dean for MBA programs and Area Coordinator for Operations Management. He received his PhD from the University of Rochester in 1988. His undergrad major is in mechanical engineering, and his graduate major is in business management. Vinod's teaching interests include operations strategy, total quality management, supply chain management, and technology justification. His research is focused on the impact of operating decisions on accounting and stock market-based performance measures. All right, then, if you don't mind, Ken, you can get us started. Please take it away.
Thank you, Dan. Before launching into the research findings, I'd just like to make a few comments to provide some context and to hopefully justify the headline in our press release, which was "Natural Disaster in China Could Impact Global Economy and Pose Greater Threat Than Japan Earthquake and Tsunami." I guess why we believe that China represents the nightmare supply scenario. Actually, in the mid-90s, I attended a conference in Boston and then for the first time heard a speaker predict that supply chain risk was something that would exercise risk managers and companies generally in the not-too-distant future. And perhaps he then was a little ahead of his time, but if we fast forward, say, the 15 years to today, it's clear that he was right on the mark. And this year has been a record for the number of natural catastrophes that have occurred worldwide, but two in particular stand out. The first was the Japanese earthquake and tsunami in March. And while this event was very significant in terms of both loss of life, economic and insurance loss, it was, and this is perhaps a little surprising, it was less significant in terms of supply chain disruption. And that's not to say there were no major supply chain losses, just that they appear to be less than might have been expected given the size of the Japanese economy and the dependency many companies have on the manufacturing sites that were impacted. The fact that the tsunami actually hit an area that was not heavily industrialized did help, But also, I think companies responded very well following disaster. Business continuity plans, alternative suppliers, backup sites, they all played a part. And the event, as we will see from the research, did actually raise awareness amongst financial executives to the supply chain risk. Then along came the Thailand floods. And I believe these will have a far greater impact on supply chains than the Japanese event. And there are a number of reasons for this. First, in Thailand, many of the industrial zones are actually clusters of manufacturing companies, all of which support the manufacture of a particular product or range of products. And secondly, these zones are in areas that are known flood-exposed areas. They're protected by levees, but they effectively create bowls. And once the levees were breached, which they were, the water rushed in, filled the bowls, and then due to the topography, these are taking months to drain. And third, Thailand was the alternative manufacturing location for many companies that were impacted by the Japanese earthquake. But what's interesting is that Thailand is a relatively small economy when you compare it to, say, Japan. Thailand had a GDP, and this is on a purchasing power parity basis, at the end of 2010 of about $590 billion versus Japan, which was $4.3 trillion. China, by the way, had a GDP of about $10 trillion at the end of 2010. So I think it's fair to say that Thailand has truly punched above its weight in terms of its impact on the global supply chains. And if we look at China, there are some very interesting facts. It was a while ago, but the UK Times noted that by 2020, about 80% of Chinese manufacturing would be located in flood-prone zones. And more recently, in fact, December 5th, a piece of research from Aon Benfield issued in its China Property and Casualty Insurance and Research report noted that 5 of the top 10 deadliest natural disasters in history occurred in China, with some of the recent events affecting over 70% of China's land and more than half its population. And these are exposures from flood, earthquake, and also typhoon. I left the slide of the flood in Thailand on the screen purposely because if you keep that picture in your mind, and we move to the Pearl River Delta. Here we've got approximately 10% of China's 10 trillion GDP. It's approximately 29% of total trade flows, China trade flows through this area. So it's nearly twice the size in terms of GDP of Thailand. And if the Pearl River Delta was a standalone independent country, it would be the world's 16th largest economy. Now, as the word delta implies, this is an area, much of which is below sea level, and is extremely vulnerable to damage from typhoons, and particularly to storm surge, which is traditionally associated with typhoons. So I guess what's the point of this? Well, basically, that one of the major, if not the major threat to supply chain continuity comes from natural catastrophes. And China is a key part of many companies' supply chains and is subject to significant natural hazard exposures. Now, that's not to say that single events such as fires or product defects cannot disrupt an organization's supply chain. They clearly can, and they do. But it's the scale of disruption that a natural catastrophe causes that's the real threat. And I think the events that occurred in both Japan and Thailand do testify to this. The other reality is that while the Chinese government is acutely aware of the need to manage risk more effectively and is putting a lot of energy into that, especially in the area of natural catastrophes, the majority of Chinese businesses are not particularly sophisticated when it comes to managing risks. Just a couple of points about natural catastrophes. It does sound a little bit like it's doom and gloom, but the reality is that about natural catastrophe exposures, they're predictable events. You may not know exactly when they're going to happen, but they are predictable. They will happen. They are inevitable. If you're in a flood zone, at some point it's going to flood. The reality also is that a lot of losses are preventable through good engineering, site selection, and also the disruptions, by and large, through good disaster recovery and business continuity plans are manageable. So to the study. This is the FM Global Supply Chain Risk Study. And the methodology. FM Global commissioned TNS, this is a global market research firm, to carry out this research, and it was done between July and September of this year. So that's after the earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear meltdown, but before the Thailand floods. 100 financial executives were surveyed, and they represented large North American headquartered global corporations with U.S. dollars $1 billion in sales. So a key finding of the research was that about twice as many companies surveyed, that's 86% versus 43%, say they are far more reliant on China as part of their supply chain for their key product lines than they are on Japan, which is interesting given the potential for supply chain disruption that clearly exists. 83% of companies surveyed considered supply chain distribution a moderate to great risk. So at least here we do have a degree of awareness of the problem. Now, before the Japan earthquake, 61% of companies reliant on China for their supply chain were concerned about natural disaster-related disruptions. So that's before the earthquake. Concern went up after the earthquake, and that's probably not surprising, when 95% of companies reliant on China for their supply chain reliant on China for their supply chains were concerned about natural disasters. And then we have mitigation strategies. What are these companies considering in order to mitigate the supply chain exposure from natural hazards in China? And there are three leading topics. One is the increased alternative sourcing. The other is increased collaboration with suppliers in mitigating risk, and also implementing a more robust risk management process. So, it's not just awareness, but it's also taking action. Perhaps. And I say perhaps simply because for those of us who have been involved in complex supply chains, we know it's a lot easier to say it than actually do it. And let me use an example to illustrate that. Here we have two companies, two household names, Texas Instruments and Intel. Both had supply chain exposures in Japan, and both were severely impacted by the earthquake. Both companies manufacture electronic equipment that rely on computer processors that in turn have critical reliance on BT epoxy and silicone wafers. And 90% of global BT epoxy is sourced from Japan, and 64% of global silicone wafer. Both companies had disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans, which they implemented, and by and large, they worked well. Unfortunately, for Texas Instruments, their alternative production facility, and this is the ones that were damaged by the earthquake, was located in the nuclear exclusion zone, so they couldn't be accessed. Intel's facilities were also damaged in Japan, but their alternative supplier was in Canada and not affected. Well, obviously, there's a lot more to this particular story. This is one illustration when you look at the share price following the event. And I think what it really illustrates is the importance, really understanding the supply chain. Because clearly both of them had analyzed the supply chain and both companies had understood it. But there were some factors which came into play which rendered one much less effective than the other. What's also clear is that companies that do understand and manage their supply chain exposures effectively, they don't only significantly reduce the loss following an event, but they also can create a competitive advantage when they compare what they do to companies that are less effective. So I guess the summary I would bring up here is that there are some questions to consider, and they're pretty obvious. Do you understand your supply chain? And more importantly, does your organization in total, your senior management, the people in charge of logistics and procurement, do they understand the importance of the supply chain, and do they understand the implications of their decisions? And does your management, senior management, really understand the competitive nature of a well-managed supply chain? Have you carried out an in-depth analysis of your third-party exposures? Has your organization examined how to mitigate risks within its products and services? And how well does your company collaborate with its suppliers to mitigate risk? And do you understand your risk appetite? Basically, what sort of disruption can your business tolerate before it is impaired? And ultimately, I guess the ultimate question, have you developed effective business continuity plans? And not only have they been developed, have they been tested? And are these inclusive of potential supply chain disruptions emanating from markets such as China? I mean, these, to my mind, are the key questions. So I guess the key takeaways are, do you understand your supply chain? Have you undertaken independent due diligence to ensure that you truly understand the exposures that the supply chains represent? And have you both managed those, and have you developed effective business continuity plans? And it's very simple to say, but very difficult to achieve. But I think it's nonetheless essential to maintaining the integrity of what are ever increasingly important supply chains. So thanks for your time and attention. Now let me hand you over to Vinod.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. Very interesting data. And I want to build on some of the points that Ken made. And one of the things Ken mentioned was that there's a lot of awareness about supply chain risk and disruption. And I've come across some recent surveys which basically come to similar conclusion. There was a survey done by McKinsey in 2011. And about 70% of the executives indicated that the supply chain risk has increased in the past 3 years. IBM did a study in 2009, and supply chain risk management or supply chain disruption management was mentioned as the second most important issue. Interestingly, a more recent survey by Chainlink Research looked at the same issue, and what they uncovered was that although the awareness of supply chain risk is pretty high, about more than 80% of the companies are very reactive about it, and perhaps 20% are very proactive. So, you kind of get the sense that it's an important issue, but you also get a feeling that not many companies are taking proactive steps on dealing with that. And one of the reasons that this might be happening is that we still don't have a very good understanding of what could be the financial implications if your firm experiences a supply chain disruption or a major supply chain risk. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is to share with you some of the data that I have collected about the financial consequences of supply chain disruption. And I'll talk about financial consequences using what I consider to be really bottom line measures. What happens to the shareholder value if you have a supply chain disruption? I will also look at a measure which is stock price volatility. Many of the supply chain managers may not care as much about stock price volatility, but if you're managing a finance function or if you're the CFO, this is a very important metric for them, partly because stock price volatility can affect your cost of capital. And we have seen that, for example, happen in Europe, where the volatility is actually affecting the ability of government to raise money at reasonable rates. Stock price volatility is a pretty important issue for companies because it affects the ability to raise capital and it affects the cost of capital. And third metric that I'll use is what impact these kind of supply chain disruptions have on profitability. Okay. Now, when you think about the consequences of disruptions, it's pretty obvious that it's going to affect your revenues. And if the supply chain gets disrupted, you can't provide the product to your customers, your revenues will go down. You may also find that with supply chain disruptions, your cost actually tends to increase. And the reason for that is that you might have to go to an alternate supplier who might be very expensive or use more expensive mode of transportation and things like that. So your costs are going to increase. One of the reasons cost increases is because the asset utilization might go down. You don't necessarily have the parts and therefore equipment and people are not fully utilized. Your inventory might become imbalanced in some sense. You may have excess inventory of certain components, but not enough of other components. What I've also observed is that when firms face major supply chain disruptions, their cost of capital or borrowing tends to go up. And the reason for that is investing in the capital market perceives the company to become more risky. And when it becomes more risky, the cost of capital or borrowing tends to increase. Also, there's a loss of reputation and credibility and negative publicity associated with supply chain disruption, which could have been managed by the company. So if they had a good supply chain, didn't experience that problem, they could have avoided this negative publicity. And dealing with negative publicity is expensive. So it's fairly easy to identify what could be the negative consequences when you have a supply chain disruption. The issue is how big are these consequences? Okay? And that's what I want to talk to you about next. The way I do this research is I actually look at announcements of supply chain disruptions that appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Dow Jones News Service. And these announcements were made by publicly traded companies, and I've collected announcements from 1990 to 2008, and this sample has probably more than 1,000 announcements made by companies which indicated that, and they indicated that they had a major supply chain disruption. Just to give you a few examples of the kind of supply chain disruption that might be included in my announcements, in my sample, many of you have heard about the Boeing Dreamliner delay. They had a very global and complex supply chain, and because of supply chain issues, this particular plane is late by about 3 years. Sony PlayStation 2, they had delivery issues because they couldn't get a critical component on time. Some of you might be using BlackBerry, and you may have experienced the recent disruption, the shutdown of Toyota assembly plants due to product recalls. So these are basically just 4 examples of the kind of disruptions that are included in my sample, and I basically have about 1,000 plus announcements. I do want to sort of clarify that in my sample, I don't include disruptions which have been solely caused by natural disaster. That's something that I plan to study in the near future. So the question is that when you make this kind of announcement, what kind of impact does it have on your performance? Okay. If you look at the slide that we have here, basically when you make an announcement that you have a major supply chain disruption, the stock market reacts extremely negatively to that announcement. And we have estimated the stock market reaction using 4 different methods. And what you see here is that the stock market reaction is negative to the extent of anywhere from about 6.8% to about 7.8%. So when you make that public announcement that I have a major supply chain disruption, the instant reaction of the stock market is negative. And companies tend to lose, on average, about 7% of their value, which is a pretty significant chunk of value to lose just because of one disruption. Okay? The natural question is sort of, how long does this loss of value last, and those kind of things. If you look at the next slide, what you find here is that on announcement, let's say the average reaction was about -7%. Interestingly, in many supply chain disruptions, the market tends to get some early indication that you might have a supply chain problem. Now, this will not be true in the case of natural disaster because nobody can sort of predict that when it's exactly going to happen. But in other types of supply chain disruption, the market would get some early indication that your supply chains are not working well. So what we see here is that in the year before you make the announcement, the stock price of these companies underperformed their benchmark by about 14%. Okay? Once you make the announcement, your competition is going to react to that and try to take advantage of the situation. And what we find is that in 1 year after the announcement, your stock price underperforms the benchmark by another 10.5%. And if you look at the second year after, it again underperforms by about 2%. So this kind of gives you a total picture of about what really happens to the stock price performance when you have a major supply chain disruption. You make an announcement, the stock market reacts negatively to the extent of 7%. These companies tend to underperform their benchmark by 14% before they make the announcement, and another 10.5% after that. If I put all these 4 numbers together and look at the overall impact, these 1,000 companies underperform their benchmarks anywhere from 32% to about 40%. So you kind of look at it over a 2 or 3 year time period. Because of a major supply chain disruption, these companies underperform by about 32 to 40%. And some of this underperformance is actually the real drop in the stock price. And some of this underperformance is that your competition did better, and that's why you are kind of underperforming. If you look at these numbers, about half of this is real drop in your stock price. The other half comes from the fact that your competition was able to take advantage of that, and they did better, So what we see here is some pretty dramatic drop in stock price, And that's one of the reasons why we need to sort of be concerned about supply chain disruptions, Now let's look at the volatility of these companies' stock price. And on this particular chart, I have 2 lines. The blue line basically tracks the volatility of the companies which experienced a disruption. And the red line keeps track of the volatility of a set of companies which did not have a supply chain disruption. I call it the control sample or the benchmark sample. And what you see in this chart is the tracking of volatility starting about 24 months before the disruption all the way to 24 months after the disruption. So when you look at the event month, minus 24 means 2 years before the disruption, and 21 means 21 months after the disruption. The blue and the red line are pretty close to each other all the way up to about 8 months before the supply chain disruption is announced. And if you look at what happens after that, you see the gap between the blue and the red line actually widen. And basically what you see is that the volatility of the firms which have experienced disruption increases. On average, we estimate that about the volatility increases about 21%. Okay? So that's kind of what happens to the stock price volatility, and that's going to have an implication in terms of your cost of capital and the ability of firm to raise finances to manage the operations. If we turn towards profitability, what we see is that these kind of disruptions have a very negative impact on profitability. What I'm comparing in this chart is the profitability of these 1,000 companies 1 year before the disruption, and I compare that to what happened to the profitability in the year that they announced the disruption. And the average drop in operating income is about 107%. If you look at return on sales, it's dropped by about 114%. Return on assets dropped by about 92%. And when we calculate these numbers, we are actually controlling for the effect of the industry and the economy. Okay, so we have taken those factors out, and once we take those factors out, what we find is that we can attribute about 107% drop in operating income to the supply chain disruption. And again, these are average numbers, but they're quite dramatic in terms of the drop in profitability. And these numbers also show why we see the stock market react very negatively when you have supply chain disruption, because supply chain disruption will have a negative impact on profitability. The stock market tends to anticipate that, and it's already reflecting that in the stock price. Okay? So quick summary, supply chain disruption caused significant destruction in corporate performance. Another interesting thing we found in our research that it does not matter who or what caused the disruption, you still pay, What we found is that sometimes the supply chain disruption can be caused by the supplier, sometimes it can be caused by the customer, and in fact the firm is not necessarily responsible for that, but the stock market doesn't really care about that, and the firm will still pay a price for that. In general, if you're a small firm, you tend to suffer more from disruption. So that's sort of another interesting finding that we get. And perhaps to me the most interesting finding is that firms do not quickly recover from disruptions, And that's something which you see when you look at the long-term trend in stock price performance and also profitability. In general, what we find is that you tend to experience negative performance starting 6 to 9 months before the announcement, and the negative impact tends to continue for the next couple of years. So to me, that's kind of a long-term impact, and it's not something that you can recover from very quickly. An example that I use to illustrate that is I kind of see supply chain disruptions more like heart attacks, okay, compared to, let's say, common cold. Generally when you have a heart attack, the flow of blood and oxygen stop. The same thing happens in supply chain disruption. And heart attack can have a significant impact on your health, and that's the kind of thing that we see here. Are supply chains more prone to disruption today? I believe that the risk of disruptions has increased. Some of that has been because of, maybe the high frequency of natural disasters that we have seen recently. But a lot of that has to do with how we have designed and managed a supply chain. Most supply chains are global, and the globalization of supply chain imposes challenges in terms of managing supply chain. You have to deal with high lead time. You've got to deal with suppliers which are thousands of miles away. You have to deal with different cultures, long transportation times, and so on. So globalization actually makes the supply chain more complex, and that increased complexity can increase the risk. Okay. We rely a lot on outsourcing and partnership, and there's nothing wrong with that. When you outsource, you basically take advantage of the core competency of your supplier. But what happens if the supplier is not able to deliver on time? You can essentially lose control over the situation. So increased reliance on outsourcing and partnership, that has increased the risk of supply chains. Single sourcing is a great strategy. You give high volume to your supplier, and in return you can get good service and also maybe lower cost. Okay? But the problem with single sourcing is that if something happens to that supplier and the supplier is providing a critical component, you may not necessarily have an option for substitution. And we have seen that to some extent with respect to natural disaster, particularly what happened in Thailand and in Japan. Over-concentration of operations. We like to have all our operations in one location. We want the suppliers to be close to us so that we can operate on a just-in-time basis. Again, a great strategy, but if kind of a natural disaster hits you, and if you have over-concentration of operations, it will be hard to recover from that. I also feel that we have very little slack in the supply chain, and a lot of the emphasis on supply chain management in the last few years has been to make them more efficient and lean. We have taken away a lot of inventory out of the supply chain. We want to operate on a just-in-time mode. All these are great, but what happens if there's a breakdown? If you don't have slack, you can respond to that very quickly. Supply chains are very tightly coupled. If anything goes wrong in one link of the supply chain because you don't have enough buffer or flexibility, the whole supply chain suffers. I also believe that competition, particularly increased competition, has increased the risk of a supply chain disruption. If you think about competition, companies are promising lower cost, more variety, and mass customization kind of thing. And what that does is it puts a lot of pressure on supply chain to perform at a very, in a very lean manner. And once you do that, that actually makes the supply chain more brittle and increases the risk of the disruption. What are some of my thoughts about managing supply chain disruptions? There are a number of strategies, and I'm going to highlight just 5 or 6 of them. One thing is the top management has to get involved. And when I talk to practitioners, I still get the sense that supply chain risk is not really becoming a board-level issue or a top management issue in many companies. Top management is always they're concerned about financial risk and those kind of things, but supply chain risk, I don't see that as becoming a big issue. And one of the reasons that might be is that they may not have a very good idea about the consequences when you have a major supply chain disruption. So I think if you really want to manage supply chain disruption well, you need to elevate this issue to the top management at the board level. And by the way, some of the companies, it has changed in the last few years, partly because of the devastating effect of natural disasters, where I see in some companies, top management boards actually looking at this issue more closely. Scenario planning. It's kind of interesting. Nowadays, when I read about supply chain disruption, it seems to happen from very unexpected sources. I never thought that this source could kind of cause the disruption. So what I would like you to think about is sort of let your imagination flow, and try to think about different ways in which your supply chain can be interrupted, So that's what I mean by a scenario planning. Ken had already talked to you a little bit about contingency planning. I think that's kind of a low-cost way of trying to manage supply chain disruption. And basically what these plans do is they outline what needs to be done to deal with disruption, when will it be done, how it will be done, and who will do it, okay? And if you don't have this contingency plan or business continuity plan, it is very hard to know what to do when the actual disaster or disruption hits you. Visibility, we have an extended supply chain, and if you really want to manage it well, you need to have visibility about what's happening on your customer side and also what's happening on your supplier side. And by the way, the visibility should not be restricted only to Tier 1 suppliers. You often might have to find out what's happening at the Tier 2 level and maybe Tier 3 level, Diversification. Ken gave some examples about how diversification helped Intel versus Texas Instruments. And the key thing here is we need to be careful when we have an over-concentration of operations in one particular area. Okay? Diversification can be expensive in the short run, but in the long run, it kind of buys you insurance if something goes wrong in a particular area. And you need to build slack in your system. Slack is expensive, but if you have slack and if you experience disruption, you are likely to be able to react to that much better. Okay? So, a couple of final thoughts. As you look at the information that Ken and I have presented in terms of the financial consequences of supply chain disruption, one of the questions you need to ask yourself is, can you afford the risk of a major supply chain disruption? The second thing is, we all want to make money and create shareholder value. And so what's the easiest way to create shareholder value or make money? Stop losing it. When you have a supply chain disruption, what it does is it basically destroys the value that you have created in the past. And you might have been performing very well in the past, but you experience one or two major supply chain disruptions and your performance drops. So I think it's equally important to sort of put measures in place so that you don't lose the shareholder value or you don't lose the profitability that you have been able to create. Okay? Thank you for your time, and I will pass it on to Dan.
Thank you, Vinod. That was a great presentation, and our webinar spoke a lot of questions, and I wanted to get as many of those to you guys as we could in the amount of time that we have left. One question that came up was looking at the Pearl River Delta and the amount of industry there. Can we get an idea of the range of industries that would be affected if there were a major storm event or natural catastrophe in that area?
Do you want me to take that one?
And by all means.
I think it's a huge range. There are some very large factories, and it's kind of hard to say it's one thing or the other, but I will say this. A huge proportion of all of the electronics, the iPads and the computers and the mobile phones and all these other things that we use actually are manufactured on behalf of the brand names in that particular area. So there's a huge concentration of manufacturing of electronics. And beyond that, you're talking about virtually everything else that you can think of that flows into either the supply chain or directly into the markets.
Vinod, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I was basically going to say the same thing. I mean, if you look at it, for example, a company called Foxconn, which is a major provider of products to Apple and a lot of other electronics manufacturers, I mean, they have a lot of operations there, so you could see some very negative impact there,
Mm-hmm. That actually, Vinod, was the one I was thinking of. They employ over 300,000 people in one facility. It's absolutely massive.
Well, that's interesting. And we hear commentary about the state of risk management and the state of supply chain risk management in China. Can either of you give us some background or a wider understanding of why it's perceived to be poor?
Yeah. Ken, shall I take a stab at that?
Sure.
Yeah. I think part of it is because when you think about the role of supply chain in many corporations, supply chain doesn't necessarily get a seat in the top management team, And it has changed, but if you look at what it was 10 or 15 years ago and even 5 years ago, they really were not part of the top management team. Plus, the focus has been mainly to reduce cost. How can I reduce the cost? And, when you think about that, trying to make investment to manage risk, it can actually increase your cost in the short run. Mm-hmm. I think that particular trade-off, plus the consequences, I think the consequences are becoming a lot more obvious when you have a supply chain disruption now than what perhaps it was earlier on. And part of it is because we are very global and very tightly woven together.
Yes, no doubt. We have a listener asking us about measures or methods that companies can use to identify and quantify their supply chain exposures. Perhaps you could give us a few examples of strategies or methods that would be advisable to use.
Do you want me to have a go at that one, Vinod?
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
I think one of the critical things is understanding how companies create value. And what always has interested me in some of the companies we've been working in is actually the lack of understanding within organizations as to what pieces of their organizations truly do create value and which of those locations or activities are actually exposed to a particular loss or hazard. Our solution, and I think a fairly common solution, is to have carried out a business impact analysis, which is looking at the cash flow through a business and looking how value is created in a business. And it's a fairly detailed study, which obviously requires a lot of engagement with the client. But frankly, that's the only way you can do the analysis, to have the expertise to do the analysis and do it in concert with the client and the whole organization. And this is not just about the insurance of the risk manager. It's about getting into logistics and procurement and into the senior management to get the details. And when you've done that, I think the next step is then to have identified from a risk point of view which are the critical facilities, what exposes those facilities. So you're looking at the process of creating value in the organization and what the exposures are to that organization.
That's interesting. Here's another question from a listener having to do with the negative effects. Could either of you provide us some examples of longer term, like 5 to 10 year span, negative effects on market share due to a significant supply chain disruption?
I don't have that answer, and what we did here was we basically stopped about 2 to 3 years after the disruption. So when you look at the profitability impact, I definitely see a negative impact on market share. I wouldn't say necessarily market share. I like to think more in terms of profitability. And that impact, on average, tends to last for 2 or 3 years. Generally what happens is it's much harder to estimate the impacts 5 or 10 years down the road because so many other things could be affecting it that it is hard to isolate that. But definitely the impact is long-term. There's no doubt about it. I'll give you just one anecdote, and, I'm just looking at Boeing Dreamliner. I mean, they have experienced a lot of negative impact in terms of lost market share. And because of this delay, I think they may not break even for a number of years, I don't have the specific number,
Well, that's an interesting topic, and Vinod, during your presentation, you were going over, some of the impacts of supply chain disruption. You were talking about stock price, you were talking about volatility, and reputation is an interesting one. What about the issue of customer loyalty? Is that a risk that you face when you have a significant supply chain disruption and your end user cannot get your product for a significant period of time?
I mean, I think it's kind of getting reflected in the lost sales. And the reason you kind of lose sales is because the customers are switching the business to somebody else, So I don't necessarily track it at that level, but at an aggregate level, if they were not losing market share, they were not losing customers, the sales would not have dropped. And I've come across anecdotal examples where customers have basically said, we're not going to deal with this supplier anymore or with this particular company anymore. So I've seen anecdotal examples of that. I mean, it is definitely going to happen.
Sure.
I think, Dan, going back to that original question about are there any long-term examples of long-term impacts, I think the classic case was Ericsson in the mobile phone business a number of years ago when a loss at a supplier's facility in the U.S. Ultimately drove Ericsson out of the mobile phone business into the arms of Sony. So, I mean, you go from being a leader in the field, a result of a loss, not having managed the supply chain in that particular instant well, and you end up virtually exiting the business. On the other side of that was Nokia, who were also affected by the same loss, actually managed to respond, and at the time managed to gain some competitive advantage. That's a well-documented case, but I think that's a good example of long-term impact.
It certainly is. It certainly seems like a good anecdote to tell upper management when you're trying to sell the importance of this issue. And speaking of upper management, Ken, you were talking earlier about the different stakeholders within the organization and how you drive home the importance of supply chain management within your company. Can you talk to us a little bit about, is there a role for the insurer in trying to drive home the importance of supply chain risk management to the C-suite? Is it appropriate for an insurer to have those kinds of conversations with the higher-up executives?
Well, I think it's absolutely appropriate for some types of insurance companies to have that conversation. I think one of the more recent observations that I've seen in the press and in discussing this with various people is that insurance itself is really not the solution to this. I mean, the insurance market can provide a certain amount of insurance capacity, but insurers typically, if they're going to provide capacity, they want to understand the risk. So the two things come together when the company that has the exposure starts to recognize it and looks to buy insurance cover for that exposure. When they go to the insurance market, the questions that the insurance companies are asking in order to understand the risk are the same questions that the executives need to understand in order to manage that risk. So I think the two come together quite nicely, because if as an insurance industry you can understand the risk, then you can provide more capacity at a reasonable price. It's this unknown which affects both sides of the equation, whether it's the business or the insurance company. So I do think in that sense there is absolutely a role to play.
Interesting.
Can I make a comment on that, Dan? I mean, I see the role of insurance, providers the same as you can think about an auditor who is auditing the books and other stuff. And if they find some issues there, they need to have a conversation with the top management about that. And I also think that because the insurance company is exposed to many different forms of risk, some of which company may not even think about, I think they can bring some expertise on the table that an individual company may not have that.
Mm-hmm. I guess is it fair to say, Ken, that specific product called supply chain insurance is not widely in play, and I guess capacity is an issue there. Do you see a world, say 5, 10 years from now, where there will be much broader use of a specific supply chain insurance product?
Well, I think there are absolutely supply chain insurance products out there, but they're not all the same. They may be called supply chain, but you've got to look obviously at the insurance contract. You've got limits, you've got terms, you've conditions, etc. I think what is happening though is, and it's reasonable to assume that there's going to be not a lessening of the global supply chain methodologies. I think you're going to see increases in it. But I do think that there will be more demand, and typically what will happen is as that demand increases from industry, as there's a realization of these exposures, and as I think companies themselves begin to understand their supply chains, and that's critical, because insurance companies and insurance company engineers, specialists can only do so much without working in close cooperation with the client. But assuming that happens, and assuming that knowledge increases, assuming the awareness increases, then I think it's logical to assume that the products and the capacity, the insurance that is available will increase. But it's really going to be based on knowledge, understanding the exposure, understanding the risk, understanding the business, and bringing that together. That's what's going to drive it.
Well, that's terrific. And Vinod, going back to China, we talked about the poor reputation for risk management in China. Do you have hopes that that skill or that art in that corporate world can be improved? And what do you think it's going to take to improve the overall culture of risk management in China?
I think part of it is the need to realize the importance of that, and I think that's something which is still not there to the extent that I would like it to be. And I think this kind of studies which are from Global Data and other information that we're getting, that's kind of bringing the awareness. So I think our job is to sort of bring the awareness out, and I think once companies see that and top management gets involved in that, I think you'll start seeing some action being taken place on this one.
I think, Dan, let me add to that. I think one of the things we've observed, because we've been operating in China for quite some time, is that there is, and I said it, and I think it's worth mentioning again, that there is a significant awareness and desire amongst the senior sort of government officials within China, in the insurance industry, at the sort of CERC level. There's a huge awareness of this problem, and there's a real desire to improve, but it's a country which ultimately has made some vast and rapid steps in a short period of time, and sort of bringing a Western risk management philosophy into China is going to take some time. It's certainly not a quick fix.
question. We have another question from a listener having to do with the types of supply chain disruption. And this is looking at the range of them. So we have supply chain disruptions that impact the manufacturer the manufacturer of the part at his plant. There's also transportation interruptions and such things as energy interruptions like we saw in Japan. Do you either have an idea of which of those is more prevalent?
Can I take it? Can I answer that, Ken?
Please do.
Yeah. Generally what I find in my studies is that most of the supply chain disruptions, about 25% of them are because of some kind of part shortages, Okay, so that's kind of one of the very common things. Now, part shortages can take place for a number of different reasons, so you can kind of go back and look at the root cause. The other major thing was product ramp-up and ramp-up delays, So I need to produce this product, I can't get my capacity ramped up, so, that leads to some issues. But what you find is it doesn't really matter what caused the disruption. Generally, the impact is pretty much the same, Okay. And also, if the disruptions are caused by the supplier or the customer, you still experience a negative impact. I don't have very good numbers on natural disaster cause disruption because sometimes with a natural disaster, there might be some insurance which can buffer you against loss. And that's something which we'll have to, I'll be looking at in the future, but Ken may have some insights on that,
Well, I think one of the, two examples, obviously, are the Japanese earthquake and the Thai flood. And what we saw, I guess, was a huge expectation after the Japanese earthquake because of the extent of the damage and then the subsequent radiation threat. There was a sense that would cause very significant disruption to supply chains, and I can't sort of speak for the market generally, but our own sense is that these are taking a long time. They're less than we probably expected them to be, but they're taking a long time to flow through the system. When you have a single event at a single facility, it's probably it's a lot easier to look at the results. When you have this widespread disruption, I think it's a lot more difficult to actually put your finger on the ultimate disaster effect. But I think we'll also see, as a result of Thailand, because of the use of Thailand as the alternative supply, plus with the concentrations, my sense is, as I said, we'll see a much greater disruption out of the Thailand floods than we saw out of Japan. But that remains to play out. Hopefully I'm wrong.
I think we have time for just one more question, and it has to do with the types of industries that have the most vulnerable supply chains. Could either of you talk to that? Is it automotive? Is it tech? Or what are the examples of industries that really are more vulnerable than others?
I think, from my perspective, I think electronics is one industry where a lot of these kind of problems have been observed. But in my sample, we've seen all types of industry experience that. But if I had to pick one, the electronics is one where I've seen more.
Ken, did you want to add anything to that before we wrap up?
No, I think hit it. I think it's electronics industry because of the global nature, and I think what you have to look at is what are the more globalized companies. And certainly the auto industry, the electronics industry are two prime examples. But my sense is virtually every industry today or every company today of any size has got a global footprint of some description and has got, because of the competitive nature of the global marketplace, as been pointed out. Everybody's got a supply chain issue to deal with, and some of the bigger companies are better prepared. Some of the smaller companies are probably a lot more vulnerable and don't realize it.
Well, Ken, thank you for that. I think that's about all the time we're going to have for today. We would again like to thank our sponsor, FM Global, and as I mentioned earlier, for more than 175 years, many of the world's largest organizations have turned to FM Global to develop cost-effective property insurance and engineering solutions to protect their business operations from fire, natural disasters, and other types of property risk. FM Global forms long-term partnerships with its clients to support risk management objectives through a unique combination of engineering, underwriting, and claims. For more information about FM Global's unrivaled products and services, visit www.fmglobal.com. Thanks to all of you for attending, and thank you especially, Ken and Vinod, for your excellent presentation. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.